Ever since I was a little girl, I've dreamed of visiting Egypt. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the beautiful people in exotic clothes, the bizarre animals, and the very perplexing picture writing. In February of 2001, my dream came true. While many ask, how did these ancient people build such massive and glorious structures? I have always struggled with the question of why. What was the impetus behind such wonders? Please join me on a twofold expedition through Egypt, through the sand at the foot of its monuments and through the dust of 5,000 years of belief. Although these monuments appear to be fashioned of stone and paint, do not be fooled. They are made of faith. The quest to understand this faith, which not only created tombs and monuments, but shaped all of ancient Egyptian culture, is the journey we now undertake. Two important caveats to remember as we examine the relics of the past. What has been preserved for the last 3,000 to 5,000 years are largely funerary materials. This may lead us to believe that the Egyptians were obsessed with death. There is no reason to assume this. Funerary text and materials have been preserved because they were made of materials intended to be more permanent than the objects of daily life, and they've also existed in optimum conditions for preservation. Also, much of what has been examined to date belonged to the elite class. They could more easily afford the more imperishable materials. Because of this, some of the more subtle information that might have been ascertained from more mundane and time-consuming gathering methods has been lost in the myopic quest for treasure. So what we know may be skewed toward opinions and motifs popular with the elite. Whether the common man or woman held the same views is a question that's not easy to answer with certainty. Thankfully, though, this is changing, and many of those working in the field of Egyptology today are trying to find out what life was like for the Remeth. Remeth is the ancient Egyptian word for the general population, and a term the ancient Egyptians used to describe themselves. Mark Lerner is one of those seeking to learn more about everyday life 5,000 years ago at a site on the Giza Plateau. Within view of the pyramids and just below the recently discovered tombs of the people who worked on the pyramids, he's uncovering the area where these workers may have lived. As he showed us around this site, he emphasized his meticulous scrutiny of each layer.
Out 3023 and a feature number, square, excavator, and 3023 stays with everything I pull out of that layer. I have a little bag for bones, every single little sliver of bone, and we sieve right next to the square. Every piece of chipped stone goes into a bag of lithics.
The large wall you see is called the Wall of Crows, and 5,000 years ago it separated the workers' living space from the sacred pyramid complex. With rows of buildings for baking and areas strewn with fish bones, this may have been the kitchen for the largest building project on Earth. The location also shows evidence of being occupied for a much longer period of time than just the pyramid building era. So why did the Egyptians build pyramids? To answer this question, we have to begin to explore the beliefs of the ancient Egyptians and the concept of divine kingship. The Egyptian pantheon appears to consist of a myriad of creatures forming a complex set of contradictory interrelationships. And it is. We could become very involved in trying to determine whether certain deities evolved from natural phenomena, or were local town gods elevated to national prominence, or were easily recognizable archetypes. For the sake of time and simplicity, let us just say that the Egyptian pantheon is a combination of all of these. And although it evolved through the millennia and the players' names changed, the parts they assumed, the primary focus, and basic ideology remained amazingly consistent. It would be a mistake to superimpose our modern preconceptions about religion onto ancient Egyptian society. Spiritual reality surrounded and enveloped it in a way that might be difficult for us to comprehend. Nothing was without sacred significance. From the architecture to everyday tools, from the stars to the very Nile which sustained ancient Egypt and defined it. The world of the living and the dead, the gods and mortals, were constantly interrelating. Arguably, the most prominent expression of this spiritual foundation was the pharaoh. The pharaoh was both divine and human, the essential link between Egypt and the gods. The primary purpose of the pharaoh was to establish and maintain Ma'at. Ma'at is a difficult word to define. It meant not only justice and order, but also a harmony that could surmount chaos. This chaos, in some contexts, has been referred to as a state of uncreatedness. Chaos, it seems, was feared in Egypt perhaps even more than death. Or perhaps to the ancient Egyptians, it was the same thing. The importance of Ma'at can perhaps be illustrated by Akhenaten, an 18th dynasty pharaoh who's considered by some to be the first monotheist. Although he banned worship of all other gods but the sun disk Aten, he did not eliminate Ma'at. He professed that Ma'at was the breath of the Aten, and indicated this in reliefs which depicted him by wind-swept ribbons on his crown. Ma'at was personified as a beautiful goddess with a feather on her head. In his role as king, the pharaoh was the hawk-headed god Horus. Horus's father Osiris, in one of the many versions of the creation of Egypt, is the legendary founder of the civilization. Osiris's brother Seth is jealous of the people's love for Osiris and plots to usurp him permanently. Eventually, Seth succeeds in dismembering Osiris and scattering his body all over Egypt. Through the use of magic, Isis, Osiris's wife, manages to become impregnated by the dead Osiris. Horus, the fruit of this miraculous consummation, then avenges his father's death and assumes rule of Egypt. Osiris in turn becomes the ruler of the underworld. So each pharaoh rules as Horus, and upon his death becomes Osiris. The pharaoh was also the son of the sun god Re. Re's daily emergence, after overcoming many obstacles throughout the darkness in the hours of the night, echoed the Egyptians' aspirations for rebirth. If the average ancient Egyptian was to have any hope at all for life after death, it was essential for the pharaoh to achieve afterlife. As the pharaoh goes, so goes the rest of Egypt. In these multifaceted identifications, the king is the living image of the Egyptians' most cherished mythos. The living, the reborn, the deities, they were all a part of the landscape of the mind for Egyptian society. The pyramids and mortuary temples of the pharaohs provided not only a jumping-off place to enter the afterlife, but a recognizable point to return to when called upon by the living. That is why it was so important to have a recognizable form to return to, whether it was a mummy or a statue. Did the Egyptians believe in an actual resurrection of the body? Some texts would indicate that this is the case. If so, then mummification would serve a twofold purpose. One of the most moving images I have ever seen of humanity's hope for life after death was discovered at the pyramid complex at Saqqara. There, a statue in the image of Pharaoh Djoser is eternally gazing out at the imperishable stars through 2 holes carved in the stone of his mortuary temple. During the 5th dynasty, something new appears in the tombs: hieroglyphic text, on sarcophagi and inside the tomb chamber. Here is one of the earliest examples. These pyramid texts were to evolve and multiply into a collection of fascinating literature whose motifs would remain the heart of Egyptian hopes for the next world for the next 3 millennia. The Valley of the Kings is the ideal place to examine some of this literature. Dominated by a pyramid-shaped rock formation called Merit Sager by the ancient Egyptians, meaning she who loves silence, the valley must have appeared the perfect final resting place for the pharaoh after rampant tomb robbing made it necessary to keep the sites of the tombs secret. Some of this literature resembles nothing so much as a road map. On the ceiling, you're likely to find the sky goddess Nut giving birth to the sun in the morning and then eating the sun at night. The journey of the sun through the dark hours of the night is represented along the walls, with each hour presenting a new danger to be overcome by the sun god and in turn by the owner of the tomb. These images are spellbinding and have always seemed to me to represent the defeat of the monsters that lie within us all. Alongside and sometimes concluding these books, which use the mythology of the sun god as a starting point, you may find the weighing of the heart ceremony, which takes place before the god Osiris. After a series of statements in which the deceased declares he or she did no wrong, his or her heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If they are in balance, or if the heart is lighter, the tomb's owner becomes the Osiris. If the deceased heart is heavier than the feather of Ma'at, he or she is gobbled up by a horrible monster.